And I'm back with another real minimum requirement. This time will be Spider-Man Remastered. That overwhelmingly positive game requires Intel i3-4160 or AMD equivalent, 8GB of RAM, a GTX 950 or AMD Radeon RX 570. There takes 12 and 75GB of space. Don't know if it's SSD or HDD. On that note, welcome to Respawn PC. I'm Dunk. Let's game on. The spec we're going to start with will be the i3-6100, which is the closest I have to the i3-4160. Both feature 2-core 4-thread. The 6100 is 3.7 GHz in 2015 and the 4160 is 3.6 from 2014. There's only about a 1-3% difference in performance, so I won't think this will affect that much the performance in the game. And we're going to use the 8GB of RAM and the NVIDIA GTX950, so we'll be as the proposed recommend setting to see how it fares. So that first gameplay is at 720p, low settings with FSR quality enabled. And we're reaching a 58 FPS, just under 60. It's highly playable and it's super smooth. So Insomniac Game pretty much bullseye the proposed minimum requirement. The spec we're going to start with will be the i3-6100, which is the closest I have to the i3-4160. Both feature 2-core 4-thread. The 6100 is 3.7 GHz in 2015 and the 4160 is 3.6 from 2014. There's only about a 1-3% difference in performance, so I won't think this will affect that much the performance in the game. And we're going to use the 8GB of RAM and the NVIDIA GTX950, so we'll be as the proposed recommend setting to see how it fares. So that first gameplay is at 720p, low settings with FSR quality enabled. And we're reaching a 58 FPS, just under 60. It's highly playable and it's super smooth. So Insomniac Game pretty much bullseye the proposed minimum requirement. For the GPU AMD side of things, they propose the RX 470, which from my point of view is way overkill of the GTX 950 for the minimum requirement. So I went with the R7 370, which is way closer to the GTX 950. And with the R7 370, we reach an average of 60 FPS, a better result than the GTX 950 at 720p low with FSR quality. So we have our winner spec for the 720p low. If you don't mind playing at 30 FPS, you can crank up the settings to medium and some high, because the CPU is in the low 90s and the GPU have some leeway on the usage and even on the memory. So crank that up, the visual quality, if you have that card. Now, if you're a 1080p kind of guy, let's check that out. We're going to keep the i3-6100, 8GB of RAM. Now we upgrade to the AMD R9 380, 4GB variant. We're going to play at 1080p, low FSR quality, and we reach an average of 59 FPS. That is highly playable for 1080p. I think we already find our winner, but I want to try also some AMD CPU. The first one we try is the Ryzen 5 1500X with 8GB and the GTX 960 4GB to find out if it can play 1080p low, and it can. With FSR quality, we have an average of 48 FPS. It's highly playable, it's not 60 FPS, but it's not under 30 either. So even your whole Ryzen CPU can manage to play this game easily. Even though this CPU is a 4-core 8-thread compared to the 2-core 4-thread on the Intel side, it will manage a similar result, at least in this game. So next up will be the GTX 970, still with the Ryzen 5 1500X. And for some reason we are at 50 FPS, even though the CPU and the GPU are not maxed out, the VRAM is not maxed out, and the RAM is not maxed out either. Maybe the CPU is missing something by being that old, I don't know, but we should reach easily 60 FPS with that setup, or I missed something somewhere in the setting. And now if we not really upgrade but more update the CPU to the Ryzen 3 3100, but back to the GTX 960, we get the FPS of 51. Same FPS when we're using the Ryzen 5 1500X with the GTX 970. I don't know, is it not well optimized for AMD CPU? Is it really just this game? Because of the game, the Ryzen 5 1500X fare better than the i3 6100. But when I throw in the GTX 970 with the Ryzen 3 3100, we reach an FPS of a 60. The GPU still have some usage space, and same the CPU. Pretty sure you can crank up a little bit of a medium here and there, because we're not even using the 4GB of VRAM of the GTX 970. I guess we have a winner-ish for the 1080p 60 FPS. But look, I just want to show you guys that the GTX 960 can do 1080p at low. 60 FPS when it's paired with Intel side of things. The i3-6100, back to this one, we have a stable 60 FPS and really smooth gameplay. It is a winner, but compared to the AMD side of thing, you need a 970 to get that FPS, even if the AMD CPU is younger than the Intel one. So our winner this time for 720p at 60 FPS will be the i3-6100 8GB GTX950 or the i3-6100 8GB R7 370. Don't forget that the 6th gen i3 is comparable to the i3-4160 of the 4th gen. So the result will be quite similar if not the same. For the 1080p 60 FPS, we still have the i3-6100 with 8GB, the R9 380 4GB, the i3-6100 8GB GTX960 and the Ryzen 3 3100 8GB GTX970. Thanks to have come watching, see you on the next propose or real minimum requirement. And subscribe!